Yeah, so oh boy, we need to we we have to work on having some sort of like digital green room.
Okay, well, it should be live now.
Okay, good. I did it.
So let's see, what episode is this? Is episode 7, and we're joined by Amy Evans, who's going to talk with us. Oh, and of course, now we're getting the emergency alert. Amy,
Yes,
I'm sure you're getting that as well.
I got it too. Yeah, I'm
Um,
all right.
this is a complication. Our campus is doing active shooter training right now. So we get these screen pop-ups notifying us of stuff. So let's see. This is episode 7. Amy Evans is is going to talk with us about IRB issues with some of the things we're doing. And then we also sort of wanted to just more broadly discuss the notion of human subjects. And Amy, is it all right if I share the flowcharts you sent me?
Of course, yeah.
Just wanted to check. And let's see, that should be on the display. Yeah. Oh, and you know what? What I should do actually is, let me see if I can just share this. Nathaniel, that way you'll be able to see it too.
Okay, and I have it. Yeah, I have it pulled up as well.
Let's see here.
I actually have a hard copy, so I'm looking at that.
Oh, there
Yeah.
we go.
Okay, so that should be shared there. So this was really helpful in this. I love a good flowchart. This helps us sort of, I think the answers to what we're doing here is yes. Uh-oh.
Yeah. I think it's the alert calling me.
Oh, sure, right.
Yeah.
Because Nathaniel, I think there are a couple of things we kind of want to do. One thing would be, I think, just sort of standard social science questionnaires, because to give you a little bit of background into what we're doing. So we're looking at Amazon's Mechanical Turk. That is our subject. And we're examining the language of the job posts called human intelligence tasks or hits. Because we want to get a sense of, the human that emerges from those descriptions, right? These are the things that humans do or are on this service. So, it is both our subject, but it is also partially our method, because in addition to collecting that language and then doing content analysis, for which, as far as I can tell from the flowchart, we wouldn't need IRB for approval for that, it would seem. Is that correct, Amy? Because this would be language that is publicly available and posted online that we're essentially doing statistical analysis of.
Well, that's the key element. Is it public? Is it a public forum? And that's not an easy yes. Like with Facebook as well, people want to take data from Facebook and do an analysis on it, and that's not an easy question to answer either. Is there some kind of agreement that somebody had to sign, a confidentiality agreement? When you get on MTurk, do you have to enroll and give your credentials? Can anybody just visit this place, or is there some kind of process? So I'm not quite ready to answer that question. Yes.
That's a good point, because you do actually have to enroll in order to view or post these.
Right.
It's not truly public on the internet.
Right. We usually use the standard public behavior. Like if you're in a public park and you see children on monkey bars and their parents are interacting with them and you're collecting data on that, we would definitely say that that is observing public behavior. They're in a public place and they have no reasonable expectation of privacy. What they're doing is out for the world to see. So that's the question we would grapple with in MTurk. Do the workers on MTurk feel like they have a reasonable expectation of privacy? Are they answering one survey that they agree to or or is this a marketplace? So we'll need to have a conversation about that.
Yeah, because there's multiple things that we want to do, and I think part of what we'll have to talk about is we're not at this juncture, part of the impetus of this project is we're resolving these as we go. So it's at this point it would be hard for us to say, okay, well these are the the things we're going to do, and then run it through the approval process. One of my large scale questions is, as we move forward and realize, oh, we need to do this, do we amend our submission? Or, how much do you have to, let the IRB know in advance, and then can that change, or are you set with that?
So, I think from the outset, I would need to know as much as I can about what you plan to do. And I'm not there yet. So I'm not really in a position to answer details, because I need to know a little bit more about what your plan is. But in order to get IRB approval, we would definitely need to see your plan in place, the methods you plan to use, what are you planning to do, what your documents are, what your goals are, the who, what, when, and where of your proposal. So I don't know if you can give me, details now about where you're headed, and then talk about some of the considerations you don't know yet.
I think we can. So in a general sense, as I saw it, there are a few different things we want to do. One is we do want to collect these job posts, right? And my initial thinking was that would be sort of the easiest thing, because it's, it's a easiest in the sense of dealing with humans the least. It's this language that is posted online. That is something that that we hadn't thought of in terms of it's not truly public, but that is one thing, right? Is looking at this language itself and processing it.
Okay, so I'm sorry, let me just make sure I understand that. So when you log into MTurk, there are a number of different jobs that one can see and then decide on what they want to take. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and you just want to collect data on the different types of jobs that are out there, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I would be comfortable that is probably not human subjects research.
Yeah, in fact, I was just going to briefly show this. Are you folks seeing the...
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Right, so this is sort of the gist of what that looks like. Now, we did have to sign up for an account to access this.
Okay.
We signed up for an account which allows us to be a worker, but we can also post these job descriptions as well.
Yeah. I don't see that as human subjects research,
Okay.
Just doing an analysis on that right there.
So that's the first level, and to me that I thought would be the sort of least sticky.
Right.
The second would be, we do probably want to use this as a data collection mechanism as we've looked into other research that does this, doing things like posting surveys here. It would be a job where they would be compensated, as you can see, a few cents. Mm-hmm. Please fill out this survey. And the nature of the survey would probably be things like, what are the kinds of, it's a little bit meta, because it would be asking them, what kinds of jobs do you complete, or tasks do you complete on Amazon's Mechanical Turk? How do you feel about your compensation for that?
Right.
What sort of skills? We don't exactly have that survey yet, but that's certainly something we could work up. These are the questions that we're going to ask in a survey that we would actually, post here and hopefully have people respond to.
Okay, so that definitely sounds like human subjects research. If you are asking individuals about their thoughts, feelings, experiences, then yes, you would need IRB approval for that. as long as the goal is to publish this, to share this with a, generalizable knowledge type of thing. So yes, that would need IRB approval.
Yeah. So that was sort of the next level, was that there were some other things we were considering doing. And this, again, is stuff I've seen as we've been doing background research about uses of this as a tool. Something that wouldn't be surveys, but would be asking them to do a particular task. So an example would be, because what we're doing essentially is collecting the language of these. Let me see if I can pull up some of the language here. So you can see like this description, right? Transcribe up to 35 seconds. We're essentially aggregating all this stuff together, and we're going to be running just some content analysis of that. And it'll pop out, things like, so these are the kinds of tasks, according to the language that people do. So one of the things we are considering is, once we have things like those terms, right? If we run some things like topic models and those terms pop out, could we, post a job that says, here's 20 terms. Could you group these into 5 categories for us, right? So it's asking them to do something. It's not a survey, but it's asking them to do this kind of job.
Right. Yeah, I would consider that somewhat of a mild form of a behavioral intervention. You're presenting them with stimulus and you're asking them to do something, and you're recording data about how they do that. So yeah, I would consider that an element also of human subjects research.
As a quick follow-up, mostly because I think in light of our research, the phrase behavioral intervention is a really interesting term, and I even like the way there's light and heavy forms of that. I mean, I wonder if you could what that term does for you, or what it means to you.
Well, it means, let me see if I can get some language out of this decision chart, but an intervention is, hold on, contact with a living person. If you are contacting a living person in any way, such as by email, listserv, phone, or face-to-face interaction. So those are just the ones in the example. But yeah, I would definitely, you are intervening with a human being and asking them to do something different than that they would do on their own. You're asking them to do something.
Yeah.
And you're observing them and collecting information about that behavior that you have asked them to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's particularly outside, because I know, particularly with when teachers write about their pedagogy, my experience with IRB at the institutions I've been at is when approval is needed, is when I'm doing something to my students that's outside of the sort of the normal procedure of the course.
Well, and I would go one further. I mean, you can collect data even on the normal practices of the course. As the teacher, you are able to ask your students to do whatever it is you like. But the minute you want to observe that data and make it generalizable to people outside your classroom so that they can learn from that situation, to us, that's when it means it becomes research, human subjects research. So you can do normal practices and it still can be research if you plan to share it and analyze it and publish it.
Yeah, because even the act of observation itself is what renders it human subjects research.
Yes. And the sharing. You can observe it. You're the professor. You can observe all you want. But the minute you plan to share it outside the classroom, to us is what makes it human subjects research.
And I think that Amy, was that possibly articulated in this second handout about the definition of research?
Research, yes.
Right, that it has this pretty quick, yes here. If you're taking a cohesive approach to collect quantitative or qualitative data, yeah, and, yes, it seems like.
Yeah.
So with your Mechanical Turk project, if the two of you wanted to collect this information, just because you were curious about the information, and you didn't plan to share it, to publish it, or to share it. You were just, I'm really curious about this question and how human behavior works, and you weren't going to generalize it or share it outside, you would not need IRB approval. But if your end goal is to publish it or share it, then that's when the IRB comes into play.
Okay. Yeah, so that all makes, I think that's in line with what we were thinking in terms of what we would need for approval. I think there was just maybe one other, so we had them. Oh, right. And this was sort of a strange question we had because it moves into almost experimentation at this point. I mean, in the sense that like surveys I get, it's qualitative social science work. Because one of the things we were considering doing was measuring when we post these hits, these job posts. We were curious, since we're examining the language, we were curious about permutations of the language itself and trying to make determinations about how the language we use, in a sense, succeeds or fails, or what kind of responses it gets. In part because this is a really interesting platform where there are humans and non-humans interacting in a lot of complex ways and ways that aren't always transparent. So for example, that thing we looked at, those job posts, you look at those and your sort of baseline assumption is, okay, so, this company, somebody wrote this up, and then someone who's a worker like me, looks at this and then clicks, I want to do that, and then does that. But this is becoming a lot more complex where it's quite possible that this write-up was not done by a human. An algorithm spit this out. And potentially me as a human, I might look at this and say, well, boy, this is something transcribe. I could certainly have a machine do this for me. And it would be so much faster. I mean, I'm only getting a nickel. I need to do a whole ton of these. So I'm going to do this, but I'm going to kick it over to a machine. So kind of the crux of our research is trying to examine these strange overlaps between the human and non-human. And so part of that experiment might be when we change the language of our posts that we want to submit, what happens, right? How does it potentially tease out those distinctions? And I guess so I'm wondering is, how do we fit all this under, the aegis of an approval proposal?
Right. I guess what Jeremy's getting at is the notion that if we were to, for instance, look at the results, or I guess another way of saying it is we don't know whether the thing or unit we're interacting with is in fact a human or not.
Okay.
And the difficulty in parsing that is in part what we're kind of interested in, right? That we don't know whether a human wrote this description, nor would we know that when the task gets completed, that it was a human who did it.
Right. So the IRB, I don't believe, would be so interested in nailing that piece
and the
down.
Difficulty.
When I look at this this document that has the list of all the jobs there, once again, I wouldn't consider this piece to be human subjects research. You are gathering language from a document and doing an analysis on it, like you would in a newspaper or some other kind of document. You're looking at this thing and you're making an analysis of it, and in your IRB application, it wouldn't be so necessary for you to describe this part of it. So the part that the IRB would be really, because I don't consider this collecting human subjects data. This is information, this is language, and if I have it correctly, you're doing an analysis on the language that is being posted on this site.
Yes.
Yes.
And I don't consider that to be from a human. So I would tell you not to worry so much about how to explain that, and I get how complicated it is. So the IRB application will be more interested in the actual survey that you plan to post.
Okay.
and what you are asking the human subjects to do. So be it just answer a few questions, or be it arrange, topics in a particular order or what have you.
Would it be interested in sort of that last thing I mentioned in terms of, okay, so we want to post 2 versions of this job post and kind of look at the responses? Because at that point, in a sense, it's like, well, we are intervening in people, particularly because there is compensation involved in this.
Yeah.
Small though it is.
So you'd be comparing the results that we'd have of posting the same job in 2 different ways.
Potentially, right? Yes.
Yeah. So yes, we would want to know, the IRB might be interested in learning a little bit about the comparison. Now, if it's a simple comparison, you're putting the job up in 2 different ways and you're comparing the results from the 2 different ways. Yes, the IRB would, like to hear a little bit about that. But essentially, it sounds like you're asking the human subject to do the same thing, regardless of how it's posted. Right?
Yeah, I mean, it would be posted here, so potentially some in that pool would do it or not do it, and then others would do, the job post or not. That's kind of what we want to see, is like, if you shift the language, what sort of response do you get from the pool in the aggregate,
So the thing that the IRB is most concerned about is the protection of human subjects.
Okay.
So that the human subjects really understand what it is they're being asked to do, that they're properly recruited, that they're properly consented, and that your application really explains to the IRB what you plan to do with the human subjects. So the science and the analysis of it isn't as important to us as just really explaining to us what you're asking the human subject to do.
Okay.
And by the way, I mean, the consent is very simple for this. We would give you some sample language just to know that the human subject understands that they're not just only answering these questions, that their answers will be made available for researchers and analyzed and so forth. So, but there's just a very simple online consent process. We can coach you on the language just so they understand that. And then they're free to say yes or say no.
Okay, because that was part of because some of those, like the questionnaire, that seems very straightforward. It's like, we want you to answer this. It's going to be used for research. Some of those other tasks we were considering, it's, particularly if it's like we have an A and a B, it's sort of like, are we required to tell them, by the way, there's a couple of versions of this. We're testing to see what you do with it. I mean, and does that? It's almost, it reminds me a little bit of like when you came to my classroom and we were talking about some extreme examples, like the Milgram experiment, for example.
Right.
Do you have to tell people, by the way, no one's actually being hurt. We just want to see what you do, and how that would, undermine the effect. So what of your cards do you have to show? Do I have to say, well, we're posting this multiple ways. I want to see if you like this one,
So, right. So now we're talking about deception and whether withholding information in advance equals deception. And we feel mainly that the answer is no. First of all, you cannot be deceptive. You can't say something that isn't true in your consent language or your recruitment information. You can't say something that isn't true. But you don't have to reveal everything. You need to reveal anything that would help the subject determine whether or not they would want to continue.
Okay.
And then normally, if you are, so once we know really more what you're doing, we can work on creative crafting of the language to make sure that you tell them, even in vague terms, what it is you plan to do, and they can decide whether or not that sounds like something they would be in for. And then perhaps at the end, you could choose, or the IRB may require you to have some debriefing language that says, thank you for participating and answering the questions. Just so you know, we were also interested in the way, what have you, whatever the language is. So, but yeah, I mean, get your information more organized, and then we can work on the best way to consent the people.
Okay.
But if there's no harm in what you're doing, you don't really have to tell them everything you're looking for in advance.
And yeah, and so as part of the process, I'm assuming it's best to get all these ducks in a row before you submit your proposal, because I was kind of curious. I mean, part of what, and one reason why we have guests and we do these videos publicly is because our hope is that we'll be pulled in different directions as we go along. And I can envision that being a little bit of a complication, because if it's like we submit everything to IRB, we get an okay, but then we realize, we need to add this.
Okay.
Is there an addendum process to that?
Yes, for sure. So you would definitely have to have solid methods worked out in order to get IRB approval. We need to see the survey in complete form. We need to get information about all the steps that you're doing. We need to see the consent information, the recruitment information. We need to see all of those things finalized, and then we can grant approval. However, if during the process anything at all changes, or you would like to modify, then we can definitely do modifications to the application. You explain to the IRB what's changing. Maybe your survey questions are changing. Maybe you want to try a different consent process, what have you. So yes, you can do modifications to the application subsequent to that. Because Nathaniel, you are affiliated with another university, right?
Yeah, that was another question.
I would need to work with their IRB, assuming that, Jeremy, you're the lead PI, you're just going to run it through ours, and then contact Nathaniel's IRB and make sure that they are right with UNCW, assuming oversight of his work on the project.
And would that be, so we would need to go through both institutions' boards if we're the PIs?
So you don't need to do anything. One of you, assuming it's you, Jeremy, you'll complete the UNCW application, and I'll just take it from there. So unless Nathaniel's IRB has an objection, which sometimes they do, usually they'll just defer to our institution. So you don't need to duplicate efforts. He doesn't need to do his own application. You don't need to fill out this double time type of thing. So,
okay, here's where it gets a little stickier. So we are the PIs, but and this is something we've been trying to shake out as we go. Yeah. There are other people who are on and off working with this project. So, for example, we've had folks in these video chats who've helped us do things like shape our theoretical approach. And we've been sort of struggling with how to credit them. Is this something that if we're PIs, it's principally us, or, I'm suddenly terrified, do we need to get, at least the rubber stamp from everyone who we're talking to?
Right. Okay. So for IRB purposes, the IRB only needs to see the names of individuals who are doing the following things, who are actively involved in recruitment, who are actively involved in consenting, who are working with collecting identifiable data and analyzing identifiable data. So the word there is identifiable. So are you getting this data from MTurk de-identified? Are there any identifiers at all? IP addresses or names or email addresses?
Well, so it does list, well, you know what, let's go to the tape here. It does list their name. Let me pull this up. So it does show these sorts of, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't share that, did I? Or did I? Let me see here.
I still just see you.
Yeah, let me just share this really quickly. So it does show requester name here, an organizational name.
Okay.
It doesn't include email addresses or URLs, I don't believe.
Okay. So you, as researchers, you can't identify who that individual is by those, by the names listed there. I mean, it might have, is this like a tagline that they have for MTurk? Like you have to create a username?
Yeah, I think those are avatars or what we might call them, I think.
Okay. So
let's see here.
Okay. Yeah, this is good.
So we've got requester, title, description, duration, blah, blah, blah.
Okay. So no IP address, no email,
no
name, no date of birth.
And these are just the job posts themselves. So, none of this is people who have responded to anything.
Right.
This is just the language of the job post itself.
Right. So you'd need to answer that question, but back to your original question, I don't want to lose that stream of thought. And in order, if you are including others, when you publish this, you can add whosever name you choose. But for IRB purposes, if you do have other individuals who will be working with identifiable data, who are collecting this identifiable data the same as you, if indeed it is identifiable, then we would need their names on the application.
Okay.
But if there are no identifiers whatsoever, or if there are, you plan to de-identify it and provide it to others to help with the analysis, then the IRB does not need their name on the application.
Okay. I mean, it'll probably just be Nathaniel and I, although I can't guarantee that. But I mean, it would be this data that there wouldn't be anything more than what we see here.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I see a few names here and there, like I thought
That's
I did.
True. No, you're correct.
I see if like Market Research James Billings. I see that name there.
Yeah, that's true. Some of this,
Yeah,
like requesters,
Yeah.
some requesters just put their name.
Right. But again, the data that's on that screen that you showed me, we're not considering that that's human subjects research because, it's just a list of different jobs people can do.
Yeah.
But in survey, you would need to know that whether you have, and I think as the creator of a survey, you have the ability to, block out certain identifiers.
Yes. Yeah. Definitely. Right. I believe I see what you're saying. Because right now.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say. So right now, this is what we've got, and this is just So this is the whomever requested it. Sometimes a person uses their name. Other times, the person uses an organization or whatever.
Right.
And then it's just the title of the post itself. We can see here,
Right.
Segment analysis on Spanglish tweets or appliance image entry, and then a short description of what that entails. This is not, we haven't moved forward to submitting our own surveys yet because, we wanted to make sure we go through IRB before we.
Right.
So all we've collected right now is this stuff.
Okay. IRB matters are sometimes really black and white, and it's very easy to say yes or no. And then sometimes there's gray areas. And so I'm thinking that this might be getting close to a gray area there, just because I see names. My gut still tells me that the IRB wouldn't be concerned about you taking information from this posting about all the different jobs. But the fact that somebody has to create a username and whether would we really consider this public or not is crouching into some gray area for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I wouldn't mind running this past the IRB chairs just to make sure that, they would back me up on this piece, that this is not, we wouldn't consider this human subjects research.
And would it change things if we removed this column?
Oh, that'd be great.
And we just have titles and descriptions? Because now that I'm thinking about it, I'm not sure if requester is a meaningful data point for us anyway.
Great. Problem solved.
The description seems to be, right? I think what we're kind of interested in, at least at this stage of our, we're, because as Jeremy's suggesting, we're not also sure where our curiosity might go.
Yeah.
But right, things like description, the duration, right? Those are the kinds of things, how is the task being described?
Right.
And what's the nature of that task is the thing that we're sort of primarily interested in.
I think the only reason why something like requester would be useful is if the same requester has a particular type of task, for example, like this requester is really interested in tasks that demand, because if you look at these tasks, they sort of can be placed into groups, like, some, as we see, some want, human sensory data that machines struggle with. Like, how many cats are in this picture, right? Some of them ask, it's one reason why we're looking at this platform is because it's a very interesting sort of concrete way to parse up, what humans are good at and machines are less good at. And so sometimes it's things like sensory data. Sometimes it's things like emotions,
Right.
What does this image make you feel?
Right.
And it may be useful to say, this requester, but I don't think we'd have to identify the requester. We just have to say this particular requester X, is really deep into this, requester Y. But I don't think the actual, title of the requester itself is a meaningful data point for us. So we might just be able to get rid of that.
But you would first group them and code them.
Yeah.
And at some point, you as the researcher could potentially know the identity of that person.
That's true. Nathaniel and I would need to, in order to collect that, would need to know the requester.
Right.
We wouldn't have
probably
to
only Jeremy and I would need to know that.
Yeah, that we wouldn't need to share, but we would need to potentially be able to match up requester with job post.
Right. I think we're still good because you aren't really asking this individual to provide data for you. This is data that's out there. It's just the fact of the whether this is public data or not. So, once we wrap up, I think I might just run this past our IRB chairs to make sure that they agree with me and that, and Jeremy, if you wouldn't mind sharing that document with me.
Sure.
At some point, just emailing that to me so I can explain what we're talking about. But I still feel like this isn't really considered human subjects, this part.
Yeah, at least this component.
Yeah, this component, right.
Yeah. So let's see. So that may deal with that. Yeah, because that was one of the questions is we had about if we had to go through both boards. I guess that one got addressed. This is a question I had. Are there folks on campus? Part of our struggle here is Nathaniel and I are kind of off the map in terms of what we normally do for research.
Right.
I've been through IRB approval, but not for something like this, That said, I'm sure there are, because, I was looking in social sciences research, Mechanical Turk is such a known tool that there's a lot of the stuff I was looking at is backlash. It's, it's research papers about what is using Mechanical Turk for psychological surveys doing to our research, you know? Some of them are, you know, here's how you use it. And then there's a second wave of, are we sure we should be doing this? Because if people are incentivized to do this as quickly as possible, you know, then
it's established enough that there are critiques of it.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Right.
So, I mean, I was curious, are there folks here on campus, and maybe we can talk about this another time, that I could talk, they could maybe clear the way for us a little bit, because, you know, we're reinventing the wheel, and probably we don't have to, you know?
Right. So do you mean researchers who have experience using, okay. I don't have a lot of folks, but the name Carl Rixinek comes to mind. I don't know if you're
Carl.
Carl, yeah.
Carl
in computer science.
Yes. Okay, I know
Carl Rixinek, Ricancek, and he does a lot of that face recognition software stuff.
Yeah.
And he uses Mechanical Turk. He hasn't used it for a while, but he uses it a lot with face images, and because he just needs gigantic samples of people. And he's a computer scientist anyway, so he may be able to give you information along separate lines. Now, Carl I say this with love, Carl isn't the best authority on IRB matters. So don't get IRB advice from him. But you can get MTurk advice from him. He's used it. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Brian Myers, Myers, in psychology uses MTurk, if I'm not mistaken. His area of science is in jury decision-making in death penalty cases. And so he puts a lot of what if, you know, scenarios out there on MTurk and asks people to, you know, decide and how they would go. So those are two suggestions I would have for you.
Okay. Yeah. Nathaniel, did you have other questions or?
No, that really covered. I mean, it's kind of, the kind of the meta level of this conversation is really interesting in terms of, right, that in part we're interested in how does the Mechanical Turk service parse when something becomes human. And so it's really interesting to see from the IRB perspective when something counts as human subjects research. And so basically in our mind, we're still juggling with this, like, when does IRB treat something as a human? And it seems like the threshold is when there's identifying information. So we're kind of interested in when does a human show up as a subject needing protection?
Right.
IRB is IRB's own sort of when something crosses over from a non-human to a human is when they have like a name and identifiable features, and when you're doing something to them.
Right.
Otherwise, from IRB's standpoint, someone just walking down the street in a park doesn't really show up as a human.
Right. Exactly. It is interesting.
So
we're down here on the micro level, you know, and we leave it up to you, brilliant mind researchers, to figure out the rest of it. But yeah, I mean, our job is mainly to protect the human subjects. And you've got a lot of questions about your research and conducting your research and the analysis of it. But we can mainly help you with the protection of human subjects.
Yeah, which is both interesting to us just as researchers also wanting to protect human subjects.
Right.
But also as researchers looking at what a human subject is. I think it's probably Jeremy explained to you, we're two related but different reasons for being interested in IRB.
It's interesting. I'm getting the hang of it.
Well, and we saw there's a post on, I think, on the Spark website that, you know, says, you know, this is what human is. And I was kind of interested in that. And we talked a little bit because, as Nathaniel points out, we were kind of interested in sort of cusp type cases where, you know, at what point does observation of something get the rights of a human being without being a human being? And, you know, there are other ways to sort of back into this, like, you know, questions of at what point do animals get certain rights, or are there protections in place for, as I suspect there are, things like children or the incarcerated, people with particular intellectual disabilities.
Yes.
So we're kind of interested in the sort of fringe areas, the gray areas, right, where it sort of laps in and outside of what gets the count as fully human. Are there gradations of human? Those sorts of things.
So in the IRB world, we have a special category called vulnerable subjects. And so children are in the vulnerable subjects population. Prisoners are. Pregnant women, to some extent, not that a pregnant woman couldn't answer a survey, but if you have some kind of intervention with the pregnant woman that may harm a fetus, now she's in a vulnerable classification. People who are economically disadvantaged, all of those things. Yeah, if your subjects are any of those, or your, then there's extra levels of protection that the IRB asks to see for those subjects.
That's interesting. I didn't know. Economic disadvantage.
Yes.
Interesting.
So people who don't speak English are, in a vulnerable population, extra protections for them.
Yeah. I mean, the economic one is, I mean, I don't know if that will ever, but it's at least something that's on our radar in terms of Mechanical Turks as a labor practice, right? To what extent are these people being exploited, right? And compensated, and how is that, right? That's some of what we're interested in. In fact, I think Jeremy's even dug up some studies about, or not studies, but is part of Mechanical Turks where the people doing the work can assess and rate the people, the requesters, in terms of things like compensation and stuff like that. So, and it just sort of jumped into my head, but that the labor practices of Mechanical Turks are somewhat at in the orbit of what we're potentially interested in. Right.
And then you have to look at, the population that you reach through Mechanical Turk. I read a study this semester, and it was wanting to survey lawyers, attorneys, and their opinions about, certain tax laws or so forth. And they put it out on MTurk. And I'm thinking, really? Are there tax lawyers who are on MTurk just going to take surveys for pennies a survey? Like, I really don't think you're going to reach your population on MTurk. I mean, there's a certain kind of population that is incentivized by MTurk, and it's not the entire population. So if you're interested in getting, a broad view of how Americans think about something, you may not find it on MTurk.
Yeah, plus there'd be no way of knowing whether or not, you think you've got the opinion of a bunch of tax lawyers, but instead you've got the opinions of a bunch of bots pretending to be tax lawyers.
Exactly. And so I know about the questions that people pepper in now and again to make sure that they know they're not a robot. The question will say, select answer C, so that someone's actually looking at that, and that's all part of the strategy.
That's true. Yeah, but in many ways, what Mechanical Turk also seems to be designed at is as Jeremy was sort of suggesting, right, that anytime we go to prove you're not a robot and you do the CAPTCHA and you have to say how many street signs are in this picture, you're also then training a bot to be able to do that.
Wow.
So there's a weird sense in which, that you could have so that's why for us this project is so interesting, is even the things you would use to confirm that someone is human, those are oftentimes the moment at which someone is training a bot to do that, which would then further push back the bar of when you would know you're dealing with at some point, as humans, we will fill out enough of these CAPTCHAs that a bot will then have enough information to do it itself, and that test will then no longer work.
You've got some interesting questions there to answer. It's an interesting topic.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Nathaniel, did you have any other? I think I've hit my questions. I mean, it looks like, I guess, our next steps would be pulling together specifically as much as possible. This is what we'd like to do.
Right.
And then writing that up. And then that's a component of the proposal.
Right. Okay. Everything talked about sounds like exempt research to me. So when you tackle the IRB application, you'll be looking for an exempt determination. And I would just want you to briefly mention the piece that we've decided wasn't going to be considered human subjects research, and then just focus on what is. So the survey, basically the survey itself, and the comparison of the fact that you may enter this survey a couple different times.
Mm-hmm.
So it would those would be exempt?
Yeah. I would think this would be, this is exempt. This is an exempt study. The 3 categories are exempt, expedited, and full board. So exempt means that it's less than minimal risk. There really isn't much risk to the subjects. That's what we're evaluating this on, risk to subject. And I wouldn't think that there's much risk involved in this study.
So even things like questionnaires, still because they pose minimal risk? Oh, okay.
Yeah. Unless you're asking, some questions about sensitive questions, like whether you were in prison or that they would reveal something that may put them at risk or upset them psychologically or, be some danger to them. But it doesn't sound like your questions are going to be putting any human beings at risk.
Yeah, I mean, I think potentially the most would be with something like, how do you feel about your compensation for this kind of task or something like that?
I wouldn't consider that risk, but even if you do ask risky questions, then that would be mitigated by whether or not we are collecting any identifiers from them. So even if you are asking potentially risky questions, as long as you tell us that there's no way for you as a researcher to know the identity of that person, then there really isn't a risk, and we would consider that an exempt application.
Okay. All right, well, that sounds like good next steps. I mean, I'm thinking, let's see, it'll probably be a little bit before we pull this together, though, I would suspect.
Okay.
Because right now, mostly what we're doing is collecting that post data. But yeah, we'll have to start. Yeah. Yeah, well, because we'll need to think about, what would the survey entail and that kind of stuff. And I think we're starting to get enough of an understanding of the platform to at least know what would be good questions to ask.
Yeah. So when you finalize that, then submit your application, and if something should have to tweak afterwards, you can submit a modification, but it is best to get it all.
Okay.
Because it's a process to go through, getting approval and then getting approval for a modification. So so let me know in the meantime if you're stuck on something or you want to talk about it. I'm happy to help with that.
Is there any issue with me continuing to collect the data that I showed you now?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
I don't believe so. But do send me that document if you don't mind, and I'll just make sure that.
Yeah. Let me just. Okay. I think that's it. Nathan, did you have anything else?
No, this has been fantastic.
Yeah.
Good.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Okay. You're welcome. Good luck with your project.
Thank you, and we'll be in touch.
Yes.
All right. Great.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, I guess it's just us now, Cowboy.
Yeah.
All right, well, that was really interesting.
Yeah, I was kind of getting at it, but it's interesting from the standpoint of our kind of larger, theoretical thrust that IRB really sees its approach to the human is very it's defense protection oriented.
Yeah.
And so essentially, if no one's at risk, they don't really show up to IRB as human.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's right.
I don't know what to do with that, but it's an interesting kind of that what's their, to use some of our language, the cultural technique of IRB is about risk and vulnerability. And so that's where it draws. That's how the only humans that IRB sees as humans are humans at some level of risk.
Yeah, that's actually
all of its categories are exempt is minimal risk, expedited is moderate risk, full board would be it's all risk to the human. So for IRB, a human is a subject at risk.
At risk, yeah, that's interesting, right? I mean, embedded, because that's what the kind of questions we're picking at here is that notion of the human is what's embedded in it, right? What does it presume? And it seems like the presumption is a subject, an entity that, yeah, is at risk, can be harmed in particular ways. It seems to be sort of
Right.
the principle, organizing principle is harm.
Yeah. Whereas mechanical Turk is
Maybe labor
labor or intellectual labor. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Harm as
that was doubly interesting. And I also think it's useful going back to our conversation about collaboration is at what, at least from IRB's standpoint, a co-author or collaborator on this project at a certain level is at what level of access do they have to the data that we're working with?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And related to that, I mean, that data right now is shared. So I'm wondering if minimally I need to hide the requester information, because that is a gray area of public.
yeah, I mean, if she was because some of them had names, some of them didn't. There's, I mean, precisely with this, that by virtue of some of the anonymity and stuff of this being an online platform, right, being able to know that the name of the requester is in fact an identifier, any more than a pseudonym might be. So
yeah. So I mean, I'll look into that. Interesting stuff. I mean, and then we'll have to pull together in order to go through that process. Yeah, questionnaire, the kinds of things we'd like to post. So we will have to make some decisions. We don't have to do it now about, okay, so what hits are we actually going to post? As much as possible, we'll have to articulate, here's the questionnaire. If, one of the hits we want to post is just a straight up questionnaire about, what sort of jobs do you do? Or, can you classify these terms or whatever?
Yeah.
Gosh, it's interesting because, because some of these parts are dependent upon other parts.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it would be enough to say, if I give you 20 terms, can you categorize those? But I wouldn't be able to provide the terms because I haven't run the data yet. And in order to do that, I need to appropriately collect this data. I don't have the terms yet.
Right, because in part, as you were suggesting, I think the reason that in part, as you suggested, that we're getting somewhat closer to the survey as we learn, right, in part that the survey, right, when we actually then do a more, to use that language, when there's actually a kind of behavioral intervention, right, a lot of that is predicated upon having already done analysis of the hits. Because in part, the survey is step 2.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder if that's if
the data collection and the whatever analyses we do on the data, that we then use the survey to basically deploy that data. Like, here's what we think we found based on our data analysis of these hits, our discursive analysis of that. Then it seems like, at least as I was understanding, I think as you're understanding it, that would then, we'd then sort of remediate that as a survey that would go back into that. But to go back in, we'd already have to have a pretty, maybe not extensive, but working knowledge of, to be able to organize a survey that generated the information that we'd need to already have a pretty good sense of how these hits work and what language is used in them.
Yeah. So
I wonder if in that sense we're not as close to the survey as we might.
No, because I mean, it seems like it would be in phases. The first phase would be collect the data that we've been collecting and then do some form of analysis on that. Phase 2 would be posting hits themselves. And it would probably make sense not to do those concurrently because if for no other reason, there's the minimal chance of polluting the sample you're observing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
If your own hits are in that.
Right. And the survey just might not be good for reasons we haven't anticipated, because we've only dipped our toes in mechanical Turks. And so if we send in a survey with, without that grounding in some discourse analysis, we might, the results of that survey, right, that we don't get anything from it, that might not be. Yeah, I don't know where I was going to say that. The survey basically might not be valid or reliable because we're not as steeped in mechanical Turks as we need to be.
Here's a question. Is this more than one paper? Because, okay, so, all right. So here's the thing. I mean, it's like, one thing she was pointing out is IRB is attuned to research. I mean, there's really two components. There's the human subjects and then research. And that's something, that we talk about with the methods class. As Amy pointed out, if you're answering this question for yourself, it doesn't count.
Right.
It's when it becomes research is something like, are you sharing it publicly? Does it have a system, is it systematically examined in a way that's, so, I mean, I wonder if
right, it's not just you're putting people at risk, it's you're putting people at risk to learn something.
Yeah.
That's when it crosses
yes.
over.
Well, and in fact, I mean, we didn't get a chance to talk about this, but sort of the history of IRB itself, is partially born out of things like World War II and Nazi experimentation. And that's why things like the Milgram experiment have become what they've become. Side note, if you actually look into the Milgram experiment, it didn't show it showed the opposite of what we think it showed. It's just, the weird example is the one we latch on to, but all the other iterations were like, no, you don't just do what someone in a lab coat tells you. Most of the other iterations say, no, you don't. It's just the one weird one is what we latched on to. Anyway, but I mean, a lot of that comes out of, and, it's linked with harm and it's linked with knowledge because, questions that we're still wrestling with, like, the influx of anatomical information, which in a lot of situations had really questionable sources, right?
Yeah.
Anywho, so maybe the project that you and I are doing is a larger aegis, and this kind of speaks to something we talked with Kathleen about, right? That, how do you know when the project is done? It's possible the project is a larger entity, and maybe what we can do is, for IRB purposes, try and focus this more narrowly onto something like a paper. So maybe a paper that spins out of this is what we are calling phase one, which is let's just do the straight up content analysis, and it would reduce the number of moving parts. So a paper is straight up content analysis. Then potentially paper two is now we do interventions.
Yeah.
It may help, break this for IRB purposes into these sort of discrete units. Do you know what I mean?
No, I think so. And I think it would be within, I mean, even the name of this, right? Following Mechanical Turks does make I think rightly captures the ongoing nature of this. And so it may be that, at least in our original mind, that this was going to be sort of follow us and join us as we work on a product. But it may be that just follow us as we do this, and along the way we'll drop
spin out products.
Right.
I mean, because see, the flip side of this is what always tends to happen with me, and I suspect you, where you're trying to jam everything into a product. And so you end up with the 60,000 word product, and someone says, you can't do this,
Yeah.
I mean, maybe
this may help us with that problem too.
I mean, I think,
and it may be that basically what we're developing is we're basically developing an apparatus, right? A mechanism that could generate any number of possible product, right? It could be a early on, it's a research article, it's the data analysis, and maybe that spins out a survey that then becomes something. Maybe it spins out a short general audience piece, right?
Right.
I mean, that we might pitch somewhere, right? So that maybe, and that might then help us deal with several questions we have, which is the amount of stuff we're already sorting through,
Right.
the additional stuff. It might also help us think about how these consultations and collaborators get brought in.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that might be helpful if we see this as, yes, as you say, a framework that can lead to more than one product. And that way, then we don't have to worry so much about sending IRB a mess, where it's like, okay, here's, phase 1, phase 2. It's like, no, all we're going to do for this is look at this data. I'm going to run some statistical stuff. And, the only reason why I want IRB's say on this is because, as Amy points out, it's quasi-public. It's public-ish. Anybody can do it, but you do have to sign up for an account. Anybody can post, but some people chose to use what appear to be real names.
Yeah. And that way there's less a sense. It's not one IRB application that we have to keep.
Yeah, it's not a monster.
Amending. It's actually just a series of not nested, but iterative.
Yeah.
Right. So instead of an IRB application that's both a description of discourse analysis and a survey.
Yeah.
They actually know what we're actually doing right now is just we're working on an article that's just discourse analysis.
Right.
We'll see where we're at then, and then we'll transition to another phase that will be another IRB application.
I mean, you can even see that as being discrete, where without even appealing to the discourse, the content analysis, just, okay, now we're getting surveys from folks about their feelings on that.
Yeah.
Maybe you could compare it to, maybe then you could compare it to that body of text and see something like what folks say versus numerically the remuneration. But yeah, I mean, maybe this needs to break into smaller parts, which is always...
And one possible ancillary but maybe important implication of this too is that now that Mechanical Turks is not building towards a publication, but it's an ongoing project, that changes what kinds of funding options might be available too.
Yeah.
Right. It's now more like a research center than it is a research project.
Yeah.
I don't want funding for an article. I want funding for a research project that's likely to generate multiple.
Right.
And as you suggested, I think in our last meeting, that there might actually be a research product that comes out of this that you or I are not necessarily the authors of.
In its ideal form, if you're able to share, if you're able to make this information accessible, you can imagine someone else using it for
just spitballing. But anyway, that was just maybe neither here nor there, but something that jumped into my head is that this maybe allows us to scale it up without necessarily making it overwhelming.
Yeah. And it also means that the work we've done isn't wasted. It just may not pertain to the immediate task. It may be a later thing, right? Because that would be one kind of question is like the theoretical work, right? How much is that going to apply to the content analysis product, right? Or is that going to, because it's not like you'd want to put your entire theoretical framework in one product and then what do you do, what do you do with the next product?
Yeah.
Things to consider.
And in part, we'd be sort of slowly doling out as we develop our theoretical framework, right? You do the kind of, the weird sort of, when people read Latour, right? They read his Latour, I forget who says this, but basically he did it backwards. That he did all of his kind of, so people will read his current work and will ask, okay, now what does this look like in application? And the answer to that question is he did that already.
Yeah.
So he has this recent piece he writes where he comes out as a philosopher, but basically his argument is I've been doing this all along. It just didn't show up right. I don't know why that popped up, but the idea that we wouldn't necessarily start with a fully fleshed out.
Well, in a sense, is it fair to say it works inductively, right? Where you're doing the observations and abstracting the theory out of the observations, right? Rather than
that it may be that the theory piece comes, that's the last thing we eventually end up doing.
Yeah. All right. Well, this actually might be helpful. I mean, it's always helpful for me when I break something into a smaller piece.
No, I think there's there's several benefits of doing it.
Yeah.
One of which is just logistically.
Yeah, getting your arms around it. And IRB, I mean, because I can write an easier thing for IRB that's, I just want to collect this data. Can I do that? And then do content analysis. Can I do that? You know?
Yeah, because I don't know how. I mean, after that conversation, I don't know how close we are to any kind of survey that would be worthwhile,
meaningful,
that wouldn't feel rushed.
Yeah.
But it may be that now, just in our minds and practically, like, no, that's actually step 2, and step 2 is a different publication. It's a separate publication. It's not.
Well, and even just collecting this data, you know, takes several weeks just because of the nature of it. You can't do it all at once, you know, because you're getting the point is a longitudinal look. So it takes, you know, it'll take this semester to do it, just to collect. All right. Well, that's actually really helpful. See, and this is also, I'm preaching to the choir here, but I mean, this is also why these kind of conversations are useful, because I think the pragmatic needs of IRB, it's like, well, look, this is what you've got to do. It helps you cognitively say, oh, okay, well, then this is what I'm actually doing in my work, you know? Yeah.
No, I mean, this is in part why I think we're drawn to something like cultural techniques, which sort of suggests the same thing, that whatever concept you have, that concept is always after the fact of some need for which a technique is developed. You then have the concept. What we normally do is we then use that concept to explain the thing that happened. But in part, I think what we're also performing is these very material, pragmatic needs are part of how we're conceptualizing it. Right? Yeah. That causal relationship is much more complicated, as opposed to we have a concept and now we execute it.
Right.
Is what cultural technique suggests, is the execution generates the concept.
Yes.
So the fact that the needs and requirements of IRB is shaping our thinking about this should come as less of a surprise than it might.
Okay, good. Yes, that'll actually help a few things, because then I'll also have the IRB submission framework in order to pull together the methodology, you know, which I still haven't posted. I mean, I've got notes, but I still actually haven't posted on our warehouse, our manifold site there. But that framework will help, because they're going to have practical questions about what are you doing and why, what are the risks involved. That'll actually help.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Anything else?
No.
All right. Well, this was really good, really helpful, I think.
I agree.
All right. Oh, and then I wanted to end these by, if folks are watching, this one's like an hour and a quarter. Folks who are watching this, if you're interested in participating, please, of course, contact us. As we mentioned, our emails are probably the best way. You can tweet at Nathaniel, and I think that information, your Twitter handle isn't, although we can add that. Our email addresses are on the Manifold site.
Yeah.
But we certainly want to hear from you. If you're interested in this topic, we definitely want to hear from you.
All right.
All right.
All right. Goodbye.
See ya.